started to take off, and one of the engines started backfiring, so I went back to the maintenance line, and they found in that short period of a week or so that a bird's nest had been built in the air intake of one of the engines. So they cleaned that out, and I took off, from Hawaii, Hickam Field, headed for Christmas Island. Indeed, I had a navigator from the Air Transport Command, since my bombardier was not a qualified celestial navigator. And he gave me an ETA for the Christmas. And when that ETA came up, there was no island in sight out there. And there were clouds around, and it looked like there might even been some thunderstorms going on because my ADF was swinging back and forth, air direction finder. And he said, "I'd like to make a square search." Well, you know what a square search is? You presume you're on a certain side of the targets you have, and you keep coming down, making smaller and smaller squares. But if you were actually within that radius there of that island, then that's possible, you can find it. But if you were off to one side and making it where there was no island, then you wouldn't. And I said, we haven't got enough money to, any gasoline to run a square search. I said, I'd rather trust this ADF even though it's swinging back and forth. I'll just take an average of that. And I'm glad I did. Of course, he was embarrassed that his navigation didn't land us right on the island. And in spite of the thunderstorms and the needle wavering, we hit the island. Oh, I don't think it was more than 30 minutes maybe. It wasn't very long. Now, I would have been worried if it had taken longer. And we probably, I don't remember now, it could have been less than 30 minutes even, I don't know. But at any rate, because we couldn't have gone by that ETA. The ETA probably was fairly accurate, in other words, the time to get there. Although we didn't really have good understanding of what the winds were in any of those areas. The briefings never really gave you that kind of information. We did have a drift meter on the board plane. And with a drift meter, you could, if there was enough wind to make the plane move one way or another, you would generally see caps, white caps. And you would aim your drift meter on these white caps to see, and you could turn the drift meter to know exactly where the wind was coming from. But you still couldn't tell what the velocity was. You just look at the white caps and say, well, these white caps look large enough that it must be at least a 15-mile-an-hour wind. Or these white caps are large enough that's a 30-mile-an-hour. So there was a little guessing there on dead reckoning. So you really, even though the time came up indicating that in a line across someplace you'd missed the, I don't really know how far off we had missed it. So, but I don't think it could have been even 30 minutes, because otherwise we'd been way out of range by that time. We went from Christmas Island to Canton Island. We stayed overnight in Christmas, and then the next morning we went on to Canton Island. And while I was on, Canton Island had revetments for all the airplanes because they still felt subject to Japanese attacks. And I didn't quite gauge the distance on one of them and turning the airplane around it. And I scraped the wingtip badly, so it had to be replaced. But as I came in, I got half the position to go out, so I turned the plane around. But I didn't gauge the distance quite enough so that it took the damaged the wingtips. They had to take off the wingtips. So I told the maintenance officer, I said, "You don't have to redline that plane for that." He says, this plane will fly without any wingtips. And he said, "Oh, no. You got to have that. We won't release you until the wingtips replaced." So we spent 2 weeks on that island just waiting for a wingtip to come in. The officers' club was down under one of these barriers, you know, but it was so hot there that you couldn't really stand it much. Well, they built it underground to avoid the outside heat. We did go out and swam. Of course, it was an island where the ocean all around us, and collected seashells. But I didn't spend much time in the officers' club. It wasn't so hot that you couldn't be out there outside, but I mean, if you had any particular activity like playing cards or whatever, or eating. And it was the summertime too. Well, let's see, it passed the equator anyway, or in the vicinity of the equator, I don't remember exactly. Then we took off then and went on to Nandi in the Fijis. And that's when I got the report that Cliff's plane had been lost. Well, you did develop a lot of friendships, obviously. Some of them a lot closer than others. But you knew the hazards of flying in those days. And of course you knew them for combat as well. So, I don't know what you'd say, except it didn't hound you. And I had no reason to feel that I couldn't handle the airplane. And I'd been through a thunderstorm, so I think I knew how to handle weather too. And I was sad to see him go, and actually when I came home, I communicated with his father and his sister. And one of the things that I regret is they both asked if they could visit me and talk with me or visit them. And for some reason, I never made that connection. But when another pilot was shot down, he was actually when I first went there, he was flight commander. In other words, he was in charge of a flight of 4 airplanes. And when I did come back, I did go see his mother. But in any event, as I've told people, I'm sure this was the same with just about everybody out there. You didn't think you were doing something brave. I mean, there wasn't a sense of bravery. It was more a sense that you had a team and you worked as a team and you didn't want to let anybody down, and this was your duty. I think it would be a sense of bravery if somebody said, well, there's a whole Japanese field there and one of our fellow airmen is locked up over here and we're going to fly another airplane there and then we're going to get a bunch of machine guns and try to rescue him. That probably would be called bravery, because you wouldn't have to do that. I didn't think I was, like I told my wife, I'm going to be home. In fact, both combat tours, I didn't have any feeling that I wasn't going to make it. And it's strange because in the first time we were engaged with any aircraft fire, well, it was the third time really, my flight leader was shot down. And 2 of his crew died in the airplane, but the rest of them made it. But we were converted from medium altitude bombers to strafers then. And when he managed to get back and was, and they were all, because of the conversion, they didn't have to immediately re-enter combat, and they were all pretty well. But I think it was just the first mission that we flew as strafers that he either hit a tree or was shot down. I don't know for sure. But his whole crew was killed, and I did go to see his wife, or his mother. But as I say, I don't know of anyone in our squadron that said or voiced any concern about dying. And, well, I'll have to take that. There might be one. Jack George, on this one mission we had to Rabaul, it was, we were told that there was an unusual number of transports and Navy Japanese ships in the bay of Simpson Bay at Rabaul. Rabaul was the largest base the Japanese had in those islands there, the New Guinea Islands. It was on New Britain Island. And this particular mission was to, I think it was all B-25s. I think all 3 of our B-25 units. There was a 38th group, the 3rd group, and then 345th. And about 90 of our P-38s went in, and my squadron's mission was to obscure or silence all the anti-aircraft positions, because there were reported to be anti-aircraft guns all around the bay and even outside the entrance as you left. And they wanted to silence those for the crews that were going to hit the ships in the harbor. And we flew over 2 mountains, a path between 2 mountains. I think we started around 5,000 feet. And these 2 mountains were dead volcanoes. Well, I don't know whether they're really dead, but they weren't exploding. They called it Mother and Daughter Mountains. And then we dived down into the harbor. As we came across there, diving down across to go onto our targets, my right wingman we had phosphorus bombs, and the phosphorus bombs were supposed to lay down all this smoke. It hit one of the bombs in his plane and it went off. Well, fortunately they don't have a large explosive power, but they do have all this white smoke. I'm not sure what's in that smoke, but it doesn't look good. It was in the airplane. And then my left wingman was hit, and the hydraulic splatter went over his windows, and 3 of his crewmen were injured. And
I'm sorry, the what?
3 of his crewmen were injured by flak or other injuries. And nothing happened to my airplane. I didn't get a scratch. And they were both able to continue flying. There's nothing wrong with the engines. And so all three of us got back. I did manage to shoot up 4 of these Japanese float planes. I think they call them Avis. They're 4-engine float planes. Our main job in that case was to lay down the cover. So we weren't necessarily looking for defensive guns to shoot up. I had only one time where I directly tried to knock out a defensive position. And it's the only time that I had thoughts running through my head, watching that fire coming back at me, whether one of those bullets was going to hit my plane. But remarkably, the plane came through without a scratch. And I could see the fire coming out of the nozzles as I was diving down on the thing. Of course, I was pushing rudder one way or another, so I didn't maintain a constant position. Maybe that's the thing that helped me. I don't know why I didn't get it. In fact, in staring at those things, I was expecting something to crash right through the windshield. The reason that I did that is that we had one plane that was shot down by that particular gun emplacement, and we had not expected that because we were hunting barges at the time. And this is what they called a real plantation, where they'd grown a lot of coconut trees, and some Australian had a big ranch there. And so we hadn't anticipated any direct fire from gun emplacements. So when I saw this explosion and fire coming up, I went out to see what happened to this plane and saw that there wasn't anything you can do for them. But I did see the gun emplacement then, and that's when I decided to try to take the gun emplacement out. But that's the only time I directly aimed at a gun emplacement. Most of the time we were centered on shooting up aircraft that were on the field. So you had a single path that you took. You had to do that, otherwise you'd have all these planes going every place. So you had to fly your assigned route. I think that definitely qualifies for bravery, because they knew that they were not going to get back to their landing source, their departure source. Well, I could see that because having flown that, I can see how you could have flown it, and you might have even been able to, no, I don't think you could have landed. C-124, that's the 4-engine Globemaster. It's one of the last planes I flew. But I could land that within less than 2,000 feet. And that's a big airplane. But I had reverse on that, and you could stomp on the brake and throw it in reverse and could stop a big airplane like that. The blades reverse. I could land a B-25 probably within 1,500 feet if I made the slowest landings possible, as well as immediately stomped on the brakes. But the normal landing would be more like 3,000 feet. We were still flying medium altitude missions. In other words, this was either 8 or 12,000 feet somewhere. We normally never, in that plane, we never dropped any bombs from higher than 12,000 feet. But we had flown 2 missions before that. In the first mission we flew, the flak was down below us. The second mission we flew it again at the same altitude, and I don't know why they gave us the same altitude each time, because each time after the third time, the second time we got the flak that was above us. So the second time they assigned us this same altitude, we were saying to each other, these guys probably have us zeroed in. Why did they assign us that same altitude? And sure enough, we did get it. the lead plane, Alden Thompson, first got a hit. Well, I don't know whether it's first, but at any rate, almost simultaneously they got a hit in the left engine that knocked it out, so they had to feather it. And there's fragments went through the bombardier's compartment, and he had just finished dropping the bombs when he was hit in the head someplace, to where I was told by one of the survivors that his eye was actually out. But a fire had broken out in the navigator's compartment, and he was getting out there to help fight the fire in spite of his wound. And the co-pilot got out to try to help fight the fire, but then the second engine went out. And of course he was just on a glide path. The co-pilot went back to his seat for the landing. And presumably the rest of them got in some position where, for the crash, they landed about 10 miles from the target, because that target was very close to our own battle lines. And either from the wound, I'm suspecting most of it might have been his injury, or the crash itself that he didn't get out, so he went down the plane. The top turret gunner had lost both feet, or at least had damaged them to the extent that both were bleeding at the legs when the plane broke in two. And he didn't survive simply because there was no way to treat him. They didn't have anything to cut off the bleeding, and even if they had, it would have been almost impossible to go through those jungles as they were to be rescued. So he died in the water. The other crew members, 4 of them, managed to finally escape. They actually drifted finally, after about 6 hours in the water, into Japanese territory. But they managed to evade the Japanese and found an Aussie camp that was close by that kind of took care of them and got them back to base. One plant that was specific, or one mission, it was planned primarily to take out as much of the fighter air force as they had at Rabaul, which is again the key Japanese base in that area. And the plan was to have the heavies, I don't recall how many of the squadrons went, but they were to drop bombs on, there were 4 active fields that had fighters on them, and they were to drop bombs on 2 of those fields to damage them so that planes could not return to those fields. So any planes that were attacking would have to return to the 2 fields that were not bombed. In the meantime, the fighters were supposed to be there to help the bombers, primarily the B-24s, give protection to them. And the B-25s would then come in on the assumption that the fighters that had gone up to fight the B-24s would be back down on these other 2 fields. But we did have fighter, or were supposed to have fighter escort even then. They had briefed us on a front, solid front, probably no more than 100 miles from our target. I think it took us 6 hours normally to get to this target. And the briefers, the commanding officer that was in charge of this whole program, said that the fighters would not go through that front. They're not particularly trained for weather operation. So if they had to turn around, then that canceled the whole mission. And I heard them call in, saying they were returning to base. I heard the bombers call in. Of course, they were ahead of us, returning to base. But our CO that was leading our flight, I didn't hear a word from him. Of course, normally you have radio silence all the way to the target. But you weren't supposed to not have radio if somebody was trying to tell you that they weren't going to be there. And the whole formation plunged into this massive cloud layer. I lost sight of squadrons that were ahead of us and flights that were ahead of us. And I was afraid that I might hit turbulence, flight turbulence, which could very well let you lose control over your plane. So I dropped my plane down to about 50 feet off the water, where it was under the overcast, but it was raining heavily. In fact, it was raining so hard that I had to open the side winds to be able to see the water. And with my two wingmen, we stayed on the water until we passed out of the frontal. As we got out, I didn't see any other planes initially, but it wasn't too long before I saw planes, and our squadron did get together. The whole group never did get back together, but the squadrons seemed to have managed to get together. And when we got to the target, either the lead flight thought that there were some flights ahead that hadn't cleared the target yet, or he must have missed the turning point onto the target. At any rate, he missed the target, and he made a left-hand turn while we were getting flak from two other runways, two other fighter stations. And he had to make that turn real tight to avoid as much as he could the flak that was coming from these other fighter stations. And as you turn, the outside flight will drag normally because you have to have a lot more speed. But I had put on all the speed I needed to bring my flight around. And the bottom flight, of course, is slower, so they would retard speed, and assuming that the lead flight would stay at the same speed, we should have rolled out then and been in line for a 9-ship formation across to sweep the field, which is normally what we did. But as it happened, the lead flight commander, realizing that there was a possibility my flight was not hanging in there, he didn't apply the normal power as we came into the target, which was to go to MEGO power, and we'd go as much as 300 miles an hour across the target. So it inverted the fight, the whole squadron. My flight was first over, and the number 3 flight was the second over, and the main flight, number 1 flight, which is the flight lead, the squadron leader at that time, was in the tail end. So we always said, hang together no matter what. So when I came off the target, I slowed down to 200 miles an hour, expecting the others to come up. Third flight went by me like we were still at 300 miles an hour. They didn't stop. And then trailing them was the squadron leader and his 2 planes. So at one point, none of us were together. And it was about that time we were jumped by 15 Zeros, enemy aircraft. I just stayed at about 50 feet off the water so that they couldn't get under us. And my right wingman had a big hole in his left wing, so I didn't feel like I wanted to press any more power on to catch up with the others. I was planning to get as low as I could, so the only way they could attack would be from coming down on us, and if it came down on us, they have to move away, and that's a perfect time for our gunners to get them. Or they could make a head attack, which they did, tried to, and then I'd pull the flight up slightly so that we could face them, and we'd fire our 850s at them, and that would drive them off. But we did get planes that were back of us and firing from our tail position. But my gunner shot down 2, but they didn't press the tacks, their fights into our formation much at all. So we finally outran them. They took out the bottom turrets when we became strafers, because you wouldn't use those anyway. And some of the people made contraptions to stick a 30 caliber gun out the windows, but those weren't particularly effective either. So you depended primarily on your top turret gunner and your own forward firing. We ran them in terms of gasoline. They ran out of gasoline faster than we did. When we had fighters behind us, the only thing we could do was for the top turret gunner to fire at them. I think there was one other plane that claimed a fighter shoot down, and I don't remember whether it was at our tails or sides or where the location. I was just busy flying forward. They could fire forward and backward both, except there were supposed to be stops so you wouldn't shoot the tail fins. I'm not sure that always worked though. But they could fire at anyone coming on our back. If they came into us, they had to peel away someplace, and anytime you peel away, you're fully exposed to turret fire. The only place you couldn't fire those guns is when they were in position to hit the tail sections. And there was supposed to be a control there that kept them from hitting the tail section. If you're facing forward, the guns will turn forward if you want to, or up, or any place in a circle. But they won't come down below the plane. They couldn't shoot down past the tail, but they could shoot in any place 360 degrees. So you didn't want to take the rudders off. And I'm not even sure whether they had stops or not, because it seems to me there was one incident where the gunner did do some damage to the tail. But I think they did have. My memory isn't that great anymore that I can remember some of the details. And there have been occasions when they have shot down friendly aircraft. There were several occasions where ground artillery shot down our aircraft. And of course there have been times when we dropped bombs on the Army. In fact, I had one experience that I don't know exactly what happened, but this is back in the Philippines on my second tour. I first flew A-20s before we got the A-26s. And flying the A-20s was primarily ground support for the Army. They would shoot a smoke shell into the area that they wanted us to bomb, where the Japanese were sheltered. And then we would go in and drop bombs on that particular point. In this one instance, of course the pilot does everything. There's nobody else in it. It's a single pilot airplane. And obviously you have to open the bomb doors before you can drop the bombs. And I still don't remember why it should have dropped at that time, but at any rate, I got this sudden call from ground control saying, "You're bombing our troops, you're bombing our troops." Of course, I was really taken aback, I don't know. But it's possible that I might have had my finger on, because there was a button on each side, open the doors and drop the bombs. And in my concentration on the target, I might have been pressing a little hard on the bomb instead of, I was already opening the bomb doors. But at any rate, apparently there was no consequences for that, because I didn't hear anything else from it. So they probably had a bomb drop close to them enough they were a bit frightened. I had finished my missions, but my bombardier had been moved to another. When they put the guns in there, of course there's no space for a bombardier anymore. So he was without a job. And I think they loaned him out to the heavies for a while. And I'm not sure why it was, but he came back to the squadron. But he was short his 50 missions. So he asked me whether I'd fly another 5 missions with him so he could come home about the same time. So we flew another 5 missions. And those missions were primarily to Admiralty Islands. I think I flew 3 missions there, and there was something. At any rate, one of the first missions there, we flew in flights, and a flight ahead of us, and I still don't remember who it was, the lead plane got hit and burst into flames and went down. I was telling myself, why the heck did I volunteer fly 5 more missions when I could have gone home with 50?